My wife's family used me as their personal ATM for 3 years, then demanded I buy them a 200K beach house, 3 years. That's how long I funded my wife's entire extended family, while they treated me like their personal walking ATM. The breaking point came when my mother-in-law demanded I buy them a $200,000 beach house in Clearwater. When I finally said no, they held a family meeting and kicked me out of what they thought was their house. The look on their faces when the eviction notice arrived the next morning was priceless. Let me paint you the picture of just how deep this rabbit hole went. My wife Sarah and I got married 4 years ago, and I thought I was gaining a loving family. Instead, I inherited a pack of financial vampires who saw dollar signs every time I walked into a room. Within 6 months of our wedding, I was covering groceries for 8 people, utility bills that rivaled small businesses, and mysterious emergencies that always seemed to cost exactly what I had in my checking account. The request started small, which is how these things always begin. Sarah's mom would casually mention how tight money was getting since her husband's early retirement. Her brother Jake would joke about how his kids needed school supplies, but his construction job wasn't paying enough. Sarah would give me those puppy dog eyes and remind me how important family was. Being the good husband, I'd write the checks and feel good about helping out. But here's the thing about enabling financial leeches. They don't stay satisfied with small amounts. What started as a $50 grocery run became $300 weekly shopping trips to Publix. The occasional electric bill became me covering the mortgage, insurance, property taxes, and even their streaming services. I was paying for Netflix, Hulu, Disney+, HBO Max, and something called Peacock that I didn't even know existed. 8 people living off my dime while treating me like an inconvenience at family dinners. The disrespect was subtle at first, which made it harder to call out. They'd make jokes about my fancy job in tech consulting, rolling their eyes when I mentioned work stress. Jake would pat my shoulder condescendingly and remind me that real men work with their hands, not computers. My mother-in-law would sigh dramatically about how some people were too focused on money to understand family values. This, while literally asking me to fund their lifestyle. Sarah played the perfect mediator, always making excuses for them. Her family was just old-fashioned, she'd say. They didn't understand my industry. They were grateful, just not good at expressing it. I wanted to believe her because I loved her. But the evidence kept mounting that I wasn't a son-in-law to them. I was a resource to be exploited. Update. I've been getting messages asking if I documented everything. Trust me, after 3 years in tech consulting, I keep receipts on everything. The spreadsheet I created would make a forensic accountant weep with joy, but nothing prepared me for what they demanded next. The beach house demand came on a Tuesday, evening in March. I'd just gotten home from a client meeting in Tampa, exhausted from a 14-hour day of fixing someone else's digital infrastructure. The smell of takeout Chinese food hit me as I walked through the door. Expensive takeout that I'd inevitably be paying for since nobody in that house had contributed to groceries in 18 months. My mother-in-law was holding court at the dining table I'd bought, surrounded by real estate printouts she'd obviously spent the day researching. Sarah was nodding along enthusiastically, while Jake scrolled through beach house photos on his iPhone. The iPhone I'd helped him buy when his old one accidentally ended up in a swimming pool. The presentation was surprisingly professional for people who couldn't manage to pay their own electric bill. They'd found a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house just 3 blocks from Clearwater Beach. Original asking price was $240,000, but they'd negotiated it down to $200,000 because of some minor cosmetic issues that Jake could totally fix himself. The monthly payments would only be around $1,400, which was practically nothing for someone with my income. My mother-in-law slid the printout across the table with the confidence of someone who'd never heard the word no in her life. She explained how the house would be perfect for family vacations, how the kids needed somewhere special to make memories, how property values were only going up, and this was really an investment opportunity I couldn't afford to miss. The casual entitlement was breathtaking. Not once did anyone ask if I wanted a beach house. Not once did anyone consider that maybe, just maybe, I might have my own financial goals that didn't involve funding their vacation fantasies. They'd simply decided I would buy them a house and were presenting it as a done deal. I looked around the table at these people I'd been supporting for 3 years. My father-in-law hadn't worked in 2 years but somehow had money for fishing gear and beer every weekend. Jake's wife hadn't held a job since before their first kid was born 6 years ago. Their teenage daughter needed a new car soon, and I already knew who they expected to finance that purchase. The numbers in my head were staggering. Between groceries, utilities, insurance, property taxes, and random family emergencies, I was spending close to $4,000 a month keeping these people afloat. That's $48,000 a year that wasn't going toward my own retirement, my own dreams, my own financial security, and now they wanted me to add a $1,400 monthly mortgage payment to that burden. I set the real estate printout down and looked directly at my mother-in-law. The words came out calmer than I felt inside, but firm enough that nobody could mistake my meaning. I told them I wasn't buying the beach house. The silence that followed was the kind you hear in movies right before someone gets shot. My mother-in-law's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, and finally a kind of cold anger I'd never seen directed at me before. She asked if I was being serious, if I really intended to deny my own family something so reasonable. When I confirmed that yes, I was absolutely serious, the room exploded. Jake slammed his hand on the table and started listing everything they'd sacrificed to welcome me into their family. Apparently, having to include me in Christmas dinner and birthday parties was a tremendous burden they'd graciously shouldered. His wife chimed in about how ungrateful I was being, considering how much love and support they'd shown me over the years. Sarah sat there watching this unfold without saying a word. I kept looking at her, waiting for her to speak up, to defend me, to remind her family that maybe demanding a $200,000 house was a bit much. Instead, she seemed to be weighing which side would cause her less drama, and I was clearly losing that calculation. My father-in-law, who'd been quiet during the initial presentation, finally spoke up. His voice had an edge I'd never heard before as he reminded me that family took care of family. He suggested that maybe my priorities were messed up if I cared more about money than making my wife's family happy. The word selfish got thrown around several times, along with some creative interpretations of what it meant to be a man and a husband. The intervention that followed was like something out of a twisted family therapy session. One by one, they took turns explaining why my refusal was unreasonable. I was being controlling with money. I was trying to put myself above the family. I clearly didn't understand what real love looked like because real love meant sacrifice, and I was apparently too selfish to sacrifice for them. My mother-in-law delivered what she obviously thought was the knockout punch. She stood up, crossed her arms, and informed me that if I couldn't be a team player, maybe I shouldn't be part of the team. The room went dead quiet as everyone processed what she'd just said. My own wife was nodding along like this made perfect sense. That's when Sarah finally spoke, and her words hit harder than anything her family had said. She told me that she'd been thinking about our relationship lately, wondering if we really wanted the same things. Maybe some time apart would help me get my priorities straight. Maybe I needed to figure out what really mattered to me, my marriage and family, or hoarding money like some kind of dragon. The coordinated nature of this attack became clear. This wasn't a spontaneous family meeting that got out of hand. This was a planned intervention designed to pressure me into compliance. They'd rehearsed their talking points, assigned roles, and coordinated their emotional manipulation tactics. The beach house demand was just the opening move in a much larger game. I looked around the table at these people I'd been supporting financially and emotionally for 3 years. Not one of them showed even a flicker of gratitude for everything I'd done. Not one seemed to consider that maybe, just maybe, constantly demanding money from someone might eventually backfire. They saw my bank account as their personal piggy bank, and my refusal to continue funding their lifestyle was being treated as a betrayal of biblical proportions. Update. Someone asked if I saw this coming. Honestly, I had my suspicions. Something big was building up to this moment. The demands had been getting more frequent and expensive, but a house? That crossed every line I didn't even know existed. Their reaction told me everything I needed to know about where I stood. The eviction notice arrived at 9:17 a.m. the next morning, delivered by a process server who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I was already at my office in downtown St. Petersburg, having spent the night at a Marriott near the airport. My phone had been buzzing since sunrise with increasingly frantic calls from Sarah, but I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. The process server found my mother-in-law in her bathrobe, probably heading to the kitchen to plan another day of spending my money. According to my security camera footage, yes, I had cameras installed for insurance purposes. She initially tried to refuse the documents. That's not how legal papers work, as she quickly discovered. The document was brief and to the point. The house they'd been living in rent-free for the past 18 months was being sold. The new owners required vacant possession within 30 days. All utilities would be disconnected in 15 days, unless transferred to their names. They had until the end of the month to collect their belongings and find alternative housing arrangements. What the notice didn't explain was that I'd secretly purchased the house 13 months ago when the previous owner defaulted on their mortgage. The family had been renting from a property management company that went under during COVID, leaving the house in legal limbo. I'd bought it through an LLC for $180,000, significantly less than market value because of the complicated circumstances. My original plan had been to surprise Sarah with the deed as a Christmas present, showing her that I'd secured our family's housing permanently. But as months passed and the financial demands escalated, I'd kept that information to myself. Good thing, because it turned out to be the best investment I'd ever made. The phone calls started within an hour of the notice being delivered. Sarah called first, her voice shaking as she begged me to call her back, to come home, to fix this somehow. Then Jake called, trying to sound tough but with panic bleeding through his words. He demanded to know what kind of game I was playing, threatening legal action if I didn't stop whatever I was doing to his family. My mother-in-law's voicemail was a masterpiece of entitled rage. She informed me that she'd called her lawyer, her pastor, and her sister in Orlando, all of whom agreed that what I was doing was probably illegal. She was going to fight this, she declared, because nobody had the right to throw a family out of their home just because of a little disagreement about money. The beautiful irony wasn't lost on me. These people who'd spent 3 years treating me like an ATM were now panicking because they might actually have to pay for their own housing. The family that had kicked me out less than 24 hours earlier was now begging me to come back and fix their housing crisis. I'd spent the morning in meetings with my attorney and my accountant, making sure every legal detail was properly handled. The house sale was completely legitimate. I was selling it to myself through another LLC for $220,000, which was actually below current market value. The family would receive 30 days' notice as required by Florida law, and the utility disconnection timeline was standard procedure. By afternoon, the story had apparently spread through their social circle. I started getting calls from people I barely knew, distant relatives and family friends who'd heard some version of events. Most were fishing for information, trying to understand how a family meeting about a beach house had somehow resulted in an eviction notice. The few people who knew the full financial picture, like my brother-in-law's boss, who'd heard Jake complaining about money problems for months, weren't particularly sympathetic. It's hard to generate outrage for people losing their free housing when everyone knows they haven't paid rent in over a year. 6 months later, I'm writing this from my new penthouse in downtown Tampa, looking out at the Hillsborough River and feeling more at peace than I have in years. The divorce was finalized last month, surprisingly smooth once Sarah realized I had documentation for every dollar I'd spent supporting her family. The beach house they'd demanded? I bought it 3 weeks ago, but not for them. It's now a vacation rental that's booked solid through next spring, generating enough passive income to cover my new mortgage payment. The irony tastes better than the craft beer I'm drinking while watching the sunset from my own balcony. Sarah tried to reconcile twice, once when she realized the extent of my actual wealth, and again when her family's financial situation became truly desperate. Jake ended up filing for bankruptcy after losing the construction job he'd been complaining about for years. My former mother-in-law moved in with her sister in Orlando, taking her entitled attitude and her collection of grievances with her. The spreadsheet of expenses I'd maintained throughout our marriage became Exhibit A in the divorce proceedings. 3 years, $144,000 in direct family support, plus another $60,000 in household expenses that should have been shared. My attorney called it the most well-documented case of financial abuse he'd seen in 20 years of practice. I learned something valuable about the difference between generosity and enabling. Real family doesn't demand beach houses from relatives they've been bleeding dry for years. Real partners don't stand by silently while their family treats their spouse like a human credit card, and real love definitely doesn't come with an ever-increasing price tag. Update. A lot of people have asked if I regret not trying harder to make the marriage work. Honestly, the only thing I regret is waiting 3 years to stand up for myself. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop enabling toxic behavior, even when it costs you a marriage. Did I make the right choice by walking away from a family that only valued my wallet?